Hello, and welcome back to Authentically Shawna. I'm your host, Dr. Shawna Burke. Today, I am joined by Michael Sula, who has his master's degree in exercise physiology. He created a wonderful walking plan to help his wife walk the Cotswolds way. So, this is a two-part series. So, part one is chatting with Michael all about exercise physiology, planning to do this walk. And then part two, we'll be speaking with Helene all about her walk. I met Michael and Helene this past December. My mom and I went on their inaugural Christmas river cruise, and they are both so wonderful. I asked them to join me on the podcast because I think they are both great, well, first of all, humans, but great planners, great organizers. So I can't wait for them to share more about themselves. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Shawna, for having me. That's a very kind introduction. We loved having you and your mom on the cruise, and I still think quite often about your special day in Heidelberg with the snow on top of the mountain. But you guys were really wonderful to have on the trip, and some of our favorite cruisers. So thanks for joining us. And yes, I did help create Helene an exercise training program for her long distance hike. Helene is the only one who did it though, so kudos to her for getting it done, and she did it with flying colors, like surprisingly well. I had a lot of faith in her, but man, it was impressive what she was able to accomplish considering that was her first inaugural long distance hike.
Yes, and I wish I would have had you in my pocket when I did my first inaugural hike 10 years ago because I did everything wrong. So I am here to help people do it without injury because I think it's very possible. So I'm so excited to talk to you about it. The first thing I want to ask you though is, what is exercise physiology?
Exercise physiology is essentially just exercise science. It's just a fancy name for that. So it's basically the study of all aspects of exercise and how it relates to the body. So including the things that we would tend to think of, like strength and conditioning for athletes, the effects of exercise on chronic disease, like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, but also some of the things that we may not think about, like how exercise affects our mental health, and sort of the opposite of that as well. So, how do we use psychology to perform better in athletics or to better adhere to these exercise programs for our health? So that's sort of the field of sports psychology. So, exercise science or exercise physiology is sort of the broader umbrella term for all of that. But as you mentioned, I do have a master's in that, which was obtained a number of years ago. But I think the science is all pretty solid still on that. But that's some of the more specialized aspects of it, of whether you study more of the disease or the mental aspects or strength and conditioning. It all falls under that bigger exercise science or exercise physiology umbrella.
Now, when I had asked you to do this podcast, you were like, Shawna, I don't practice as an exercise physiologist anymore. I'm like, you do, you created this plan, but tell us what you did do when you worked in this field.
Sure. So I got my master's. Let's see, that would have been graduated in 2010 or 11. And my first internship with them was at a hospital based fitness center or gym. So they were both open to the public, but also had like cardiac rehab patients. I think they had some physical therapy going on. Um, and then my first job out of that was at an executive physical clinic. So this hospital system had a very intensive day-long annual physical program for executives. So people from JP Morgan Chase or Target or big corporations around the country would send their execs to this clinic to have a very thorough annual physical. And that was sort of a perk for the executive, but also an investment from the company, because when you have these very, very highly trained, very unique individuals, you want to make sure that they are able to perform at their best. And obviously, our physical and mental health has a lot to do with that, and that they'll be around for a long time in order to continue performing that job. So it was a benefit for both the patient and the company, obviously. And then after that, I moved toward so there I did very specifically exercise testing and prescription. We did the whole VO2 max, hooking them up with the tubing, like you see in the movies, and measuring their cardiovascular health, as well as a variety of strength and flexibility and overall kind of fitness tests. And then we would help write them prescriptions that were appropriate towards their goals or their lifestyle. We had a term at the time, I think we kind of referred to it as white collar syndrome, that a lot of these gentlemen and ladies suffered from because they're not super active, they don't eat super well, they're high stressed, and they're inside all day. So it's kind of a conglomerate of factors that that we would see over and over again. But after that, I moved into more of what I was really wanting to do kind of all along, which was corporate wellness. And I did that for another company called Cooper Aerobics, which I will speak on a little bit more because it's quite interesting. But basically, corporate wellness is kind of a population approach towards health management that companies will do in order to save money on healthcare costs and to have more productive employees. And so a lot of people don't realize, but our benefits are tied to our companies as a result of kind of some legislation that came out during World War II. So companies were no longer allowed, it was some sort of wage locks, wage competition things during World War II. So companies started offering healthcare plans and benefits as a way to attract workers during that time. And that's how we are in the state that we are today, with most of our healthcare coming and being managed by our employers. Um, so employees bear a lot of those costs, and a lot of people don't realize that. But when you pay your monthly premium through your employer, you're really only paying about 20% of what that actually costs. And it's the benefit of the perk is that your company is covering the rest. And for large companies, they're actually covering each individual treatment or remedy. So, for instance, if somebody comes down with lung cancer or diabetes, if large companies, particularly, they're paying every dollar for that treatment. So they have a very strong interest in having healthier employees, not only from a money savings perspective, but also we all know as the healthier we are, the better we perform in general in life. And so I helped to implement programs. We call them outcomes-based programs. They were quite aggressive at the time. I suppose they're hopefully getting more common. I believed in them. We would do annual health screenings, and based upon those screenings, that would correlate to your next year's healthcare costs. So that does sound quite strong and quite harsh to some people, but we would then implement all kinds of programming in order to help people get to where they needed to be health wise. And so, I kind of think that's the answer to our healthcare crisis in America, because I think a lot of it is preventable health issues that we're just not managing through healthy eating, exercise, or managing our stress. And currently the companies are bearing the large majority of that cost along with ourselves. And so I think a lot of the solutions might come from the private sector or the corporate sector. So I did enjoy that. I did believe in that. I still do think it's a way forward for the country to kind of overall improve our health. But that's what I did up until we moved to Germany, and then I made a major, major switch away from healthcare and corporate wellness and exercise physiology into travel blogging, which is quite different. But yeah, so that's kind of my career there. And then uh, if you're interested, I can tell you a little bit more about the company I work for, because I do think there's an interesting history there. It's Cooper Aerobics. If you want me to expand on that, I can.
Please. Yes, I love talking about prevention. I wanted to ask, what kind of tests were you doing? Like, are these tests that people could do on their own so that they can establish a baseline for themselves and track changes over time? Are these things that people can do outside of working with a company?
Some yes and some no. So at the at
Okay.
the at the executive physical clinic, it was more high end type stuff that wouldn't necessarily be accessible to the general public. I mean, you can obtain these tests, but they're going to cost, like the VO2 max. Obviously, that requires a lot of equipment and specialized
Yep.
training on the person who needs to perform it. We did DEXA body scans for body composition.
Yes.
Which is essentially like a fancy X-ray machine, but again, that's not something most people have access to unless they want to pay for it. But there are all kinds of generic, very low cost, very easy to quantify tests that you can do around your fitness. Cooper Aerobics is actually a good resource for that because they do a lot of exercise testing at schools. They started like kind of like we used to have the Kennedy fitness test and that sort of stuff. In the
Yes.
school systems, they have tried to bring a lot of that back into Texas schools. So it's a Dallas-based company, and that's where we lived, and so that's how I got connected with them. But yeah, even things like they've got a treadmill test that they use, and they have decades of data and research behind, and they calculate your VO2 max just based off of a simple treadmill test where they increase the intensity through elevation and speed over a certain number of criteria, and you can look that up, and it will give you a very accurate correlation to your measured or tested VO2 max. Same thing for
Can
like
I
a one
pause and ask
mile.
you a question? Can
Yeah,
I ask you, because I'm sure most people don't know, why do you want to know your VO2 max? What does that tell you?
that is an indication of your cardiovascular fitness, which has many, many indications to your overall health and the longevity or life expectancy. I don't want to quote the exact stats because I'm sure I'll get them wrong, but there's something along the lines of if you break people up into like superior fitness, moderate fitness, average, sedentary, or like ultra sedentary, let's say, the people in the top 20% of the population, or where maybe the population 20 years ago before kind of we had some of our other major issues. But I mean, the all cause mortality rate goes down by an insane number of points, meaning that if you are relatively fit, your life expectancy is 5 to 10 years beyond what somebody who is not fit is, and the quality of life that you'll have in your last 5 to 10 years is much higher than what people who are not fit will have. So that's what VO2 max is, just a scientific measure of your cardiovascular fitness, but it's basically, like I said, how quickly can you walk a mile? Or how can you perform on these other fitness tests based on the treadmill or running or swimming or biking, any sort of aerobically based fitness test. So that's what that means. Sorry, I do tend to talk in paragraphs sometimes. So feel free to interrupt me
No,
at any point, Shawna.
no, that's so helpful. I just wanted to make sure because I know what that is, but I don't think most people, and maybe like you said, like seen it in a movie but didn't know like how that correlated to health. So, okay, let's talk more tests because I think this is so interesting.
Yeah, so Cooper aerobics. So Dr. Kenneth Cooper, I think, can comfortably be credited with creating the modern exercise movement. So that happened, let's say, in the 70s and 80s when he founded his research institute and also the clinic. And basically, before then, just sort of culturally in America, exercise was thought to be, at least for adults, to be for soldiers or policemen or firemen or people like this. Most people did not exercise through adulthood. And he was involved in the Air Force and providing or creating conditioning programs for the astronauts during kind of the initial space race era. And through a health scare of his own, he'd been an athlete growing up, like most kids are, playing sports. And then in his 30s, he went out and tried to, I think it was water ski. And he had sort of a heart um, incident that really scared him. And he kind of wondered, what the heck's going on? And maybe these exercise prescriptions that we're doing for the astronauts could be useful for the general public. And so he started to research this and create programs. And he actually coined the term aerobics, which we think of as
Oh,
like knee-high socks and the
yeah,
80s.
Jane Fonda. Yeah.
Exactly, right. But that was the start of the exercise movement in America. It was Jane Fonda and Richard Simmons and all of these things. And there's actually, from one of my favorite movies, Anchorman. There's a scene where the guys are talking around the newsroom about what their plans are for the weekend, and Will Ferrell goes, "I'm going to go jogging," where apparently you just run for an extended period of time because that was so like out of this world. Why would anybody bother doing that? And that's really what Dr. Cooper helped create. And there's some really funny videos of him debating like leading cardiologists at the time on Dateline and some of these news shows, and they're saying there's going to be millions of dead joggers in the street and all these sorts of things. And
Wow.
it just obviously we know now that that's not the case, but they just didn't have the science at the time. You know, he sort of brought that about. Anyway, so that's what I used to work for. And as far as some of those tests, I'd have to look into those a little bit more to give specifics, but I do know there are several, both cardiovascular and also strength and flexibility tests that you can do to kind of give yourself an overall condition or fitness score that don't require a lot of equipment or any equipment, but have very sound science behind them just by the numbers of people that have taken those tests, tens of thousands over the decades.
Okay,
So
so we'll link that. We'll link that website to where you used to work in the show notes. That way people can kind of do some research and see, oh, hey, I'd be interested in doing my own sort of fitness test. Because I think that's super interesting. Because again, we had something called gold shorts in my middle school, and you were trying to be at the
okay,
top of your class in order to get to wear special shorts during PE. But
right,
yeah, the last time I think a lot of people were tested was probably in middle school or high school. So, okay, what's your baseline level now? I think that would be really
yes.
interesting for a lot of people to do on their own.
And I think it's
So,
fair to say that most adults who have not been exercising regularly, particularly people my age in late 30s, early 40s, are probably more deconditioned than they realize. And they go out and try and do stuff and they get injured and then they get discouraged. It's like, well, you know, you were a high school athlete and that was the last time you were an athlete. And it's been 15 years since you've done any real exercise conditioning or programming, and it's difficult to get back into it. So yeah, but you're right. It is more. We do tend to, as in adulthood, we lose our zeal or our zest for working out or exercise. But we can talk a little bit more of that later too.
yeah, I would love that. I wanted to ask you because, I have doctorate and I think sometimes I learned a lot of things in my doctorate that could be general knowledge, but you have to become a doctor in order to learn that. And so I wanted to know what are a couple things that you learned in your master's program that you think could be general knowledge, but just aren't quite yet in terms of exercise or physiology?
Sorry, yeah, sure. So my particular master's was more focused on exercise relationship with disease, and so uh, I think that one thing that really has stuck with me, a couple things I'll share, but one thing that's really stuck with me was um, the fact that there are so many benefits to exercise, and we know a lot of those. So it's incredible for insulin sensitivity, so in preventing but also managing type 2 diabetes, blood pressure reductions for cardiovascular health, to cholesterol improvements, all these sorts of things. We also know about the mental improvements, but all of those benefits are really quite temporary, meaning they only last 24 hours to 72 hours, 2 to 3 days, which is why people always recommend that we need to be exercising regularly, meaning multiple times a week, because doing a workout in January doesn't affect you at all in February. And some fitness can be retained, and it's easier to get more fit once you have been fit. But yes, most of exercise's benefits are quite temporary from a health perspective. So that's why the recommendation is to exercise 3 times a week, or whatever works for you. And then another
Thank you for
thing
that. That's
that
such a great nugget. That is so good. I can't wait for people to hear that because I think it's so valuable to understand that it's temporary, but can be lasting should you continue.
right,
Thank you. That's so simple, so brilliant. Thank you.
the benefits are enormous across every measure that can be measured. Exercise has a positive improvement on. I mean, there's really, like I said, from insulin, from diabetes issues to cancer issues to obesity, obviously, to cardiovascular to mental stress, all these sorts of things. I mean, anything you can measure, exercise improves, and that's not an exaggeration by saying that. Um, but it is, like I said, those improvements are temporary, so that's why we have to regularly do it, which can be tough sometimes. But another thing that is not so pertinent anymore, I don't think, just as less and less people are smoking, but this stuck in my head because I found it so shocking, which was that smoking is actually a greater risk for cardiovascular health than it is for your lung health,
Mm.
meaning that you have more risks. And we all know how bad smoking is for our lungs. And so I think, like, to say that it's even worse for cardiovascular, to me, just stuck in my head. So we have more risks and more lethal risks from your heart and arteries related to smoking than we do from your lungs through cancer, emphysema, those types of things. So again, I think smoking is really on the decline. And even smoking alternatives like vapes or whatever aren't quite as dangerous as inhaling carbon monoxide day in and day out. But yeah, that one really stuck in my head as far as just, wow, don't smoke. Because as bad as we all know it is for our lungs, it's even worse for your heart, which is one organ that you really can't live without. Got to keep ticking.
Absolutely. Let's talk about three things that you think everyone could know about exercise.
Sure. And this is maybe what more you're asking for, but I think something that I hear a lot, and I think the general population knowledge is getting better on, but you don't do ab workouts to get a six pack. um,
Mm.
Meaning there is a degree to which we can develop our muscles through strength training to make them larger, and more noticeable. But I think I think the numbers are still over 60% of Americans being overweight or obese. The vast majority, if you are wanting to work out for visual improvements, which I think is an honorable reason to work out. I think it's nice to be confident about your body, and if the health benefits come along with the visual improvements, great. But with the majority of Americans being overweight or obese, the majority of your improvements are going to come from losing weight. And doing ab workouts are not very calorically challenging, meaning there's not a lot of calories burned through that. So you're much better off focusing on an overall general fitness plan with cardiovascular and strength training components to reduce your weight, which will then give you a more defined or a more muscular appearance rather than being more rounded, because your muscles won't be so covered up with fat tissue. And whereas you can target muscle groups for size and strength and that sort of stuff, you cannot target where you lose your fat tissue. It just happens systemically. So if you do 6,000 crunches, or you do 3 miles of walking, it's going to burn the fat across your entire body equivalently. It doesn't make any difference that you're doing crunches, you're going to burn the fat off your stomach. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. And typically what we see is different people tend to store fat in different places. And so kind of the first on will be the last off. So if Like, hey, I tend to carry my weight on my hips or on my belly or on my arms or wherever. That's probably going to be the last thing to see the most difference. Yeah, basically, you can target specific muscles for development, but you can't target where you burn your fat. And most people in this country probably need more help burning fat than getting super large muscles.
I'm going to add to that because this is what I tell people all the time. Every exercise is an ab exercise, whether you're using your arms or your legs, you're using your abdominals to stabilize your trunk, which is where your abdominals are. So if you're not using your abdominals, you're going to be floppy. So don't worry. Every exercise you're doing is an abdominal exercise because you're keeping yourself in an upright position most of the time, or whatever position, if you're side lying or whatever it is, you're using those muscles to stabilize you. So don't worry, they're active the whole time.
Right, for sure. Yeah, it's a muscle group that gets exercise whether they want to or not. And so, I think social media or Hollywood or whoever puts this emphasis on some of these different body features that we all want to have. And I think just looking at an overall health and fitness goal or perspective is better.
So let's talk about, I know you prescribe exercise, which I also prescribe exercise too. So talk me through an exercise prescription. What are you including? What are you not including? What does that look like for an average person?
Yeah, it's just sort of the how, what, when, where, and why of exercise. So, what kind of exercises are we doing? How often are you doing them? To what intensity? And what are the benefits you can expect? So, kind of why are we doing this? It's basically just an exercise prescription is your workout plan. And to me, I think plans are important to reach your goals. So, I do think it's nice to either write some things down or source something from someone somehow to help guide you in your exercise goals. And if let's say we're just taking an exercise prescription for running, like someone says, I want to start running. It's a very common thing, jogging, that sort of thing. Well, the exercise prescription would be, how long of a distance should you run, or how many days a week do you going to run? What's your running speed going to be? That would be your intensity. Hills or stadium steps could be another form of intensity. Are you going to be doing sprints? Are you doing longer duration? And then kind of what's the goal? What's the point of all this? Are you wanting to start running in order to run a half marathon? Or are you wanting to start running so you can play soccer at a higher level? So that all of those questions would be asked, and then that would be how you develop your exercise prescription.
If someone were wanting to do this on their own, whether it was strength training or running, or do you have any good resources for people to look at for plans of people who've done something similar?
I think I would try and get as specific as you can on what your goals are, what your plan is. Specificity is a big component of exercise. Um, because, like I said, training for a half marathon is quite a bit different from training to go play soccer. And so I would start with what it is you're wanting to do, and then just kind of look, online with maybe different people you trust on social media or YouTube for programming or suggestions they may have, and find one that seems reasonable and doable for you, and then just try and stick with that within reason, of course, with listening to your body for any sort of injuries or things like that. But I think I say specific because there's so much information out there; it can be overwhelming, and you don't know where to start. So if you have sort of a goal, whether even if that's just losing weight or doing a long distance hike, or I want to get more fit for mountain biking or whatever it may be, I guarantee you there's been an exercise program created around that specific thing, and that'll help narrow down your search so you don't just type into Google, how do I get fit, and you get 50 million results with maybe 49 million different answers. So that would be my thing, is to get specific.
Oh, I love that suggestion. So, speaking of specific and prescriptions, let's talk about the exercise prescription that you created for Helene to do the Cotswolds Way. And let's talk about what that entails and how you start to prep for a really long walk.
Sure. So I think that a mistake that a lot of people make around exercise is trying to do too much too soon. Helene was starting from a point of relatively deconditioned, and she was trying to hike 100 miles, which ended up turning into 130 miles over the course of 10 days. And so that's quite a tall order. That's a big goal. going from just walking in daily life and not really having any sort of formal exercise program to uh, completing a 10-day 100-mile plus hike is a big jump. So we were looking, we she kind of took on this goal in, let's say, I want to say April or May, and sort of the hiking season, or the best time to do that would be through kind of end of September, early October. So basically, we kind of decided, well, let's start on this now and start working towards it over the course of what ended up being a 4-month training program. And even with that, I was a little bit concerned, kind of looking at her mileage and her increase in kind of progression week over week, how well she'd be able to perform on that hike. I really thought she was going to have more troubles. I honestly did. I thought she'd get in 2 or 3 days and be sore or have some sort of strain and want to take a break or whatever. That would have been fine. Take a day off and try and get going again. Because her last week, and I've got her plane in front of me, I think her last week, her mileage, her highest week of mileage, I think, was around like 40 miles in a week, which compared to 100 miles is not, it's only 40%. Now that's
Right.
in 1 week compared to 10 days, but even still, let's say you're looking at 60 miles, something like that. I was concerned that she wouldn't even be quite compared after 4 months, but she sailed through very, very, very well. So I will say it did prepare her quite well. And so it was basically a progression of walking, cross training, and to me, cross training was anything that wasn't walking but added some sort of, I think her cross training workouts probably started in the 30-minute range and went up to maybe an hour by the end of the program. So anything that wasn't walking, so she did a lot of biking. She really enjoyed swimming, but she also would do like 30 minutes of that and then 30 minutes of like a strength training exercise or strength training. And she really enjoyed workout videos. So she would find, strength and conditioning workout videos on YouTube, and she would do those. She liked dance videos. She liked kickboxing videos. So that was kind of her cross training. And then she also did core workouts. And the reason I included that was I'm not a hiking expert. I have never done a long distance hike myself. But in researching kind of a variety of different long distance programs and then picking and pulling what I felt was the most useful, I found some that were I didn't find very useful at all, and I found some that were quite useful, and then I would pick and pull what I thought would be great for Helene and knowing her personality and what I thought was reasonable. Hiking is a bit different just from walking on the sidewalk in that you're going over obstacles, you're going up and down hills, you're stepping over stones, you're on a loose terrain. And so, is a chance, and there's a very likely chance that you're going to trip or you're going to stumble or you're going to take a fall. And having a stronger core can help you catch yourself and not fall all the way down. It can help you, if you do fall all the way to the ground, catch yourself in a safer manner where you're not putting so much impact on your joints or your wrists or your knees or whatever, because you can kind of use your core strength to fall in a more graceful way. And so she included that once per week as well. So it was a combination of walking, cross training, which was a variety of things, and core workouts, and then recovery. So I think at the beginning of the program, she was only working out 3 to 4 days a week, and she had 3 full rest days each week. And at the end of the workout, she was still only working out, I think, 5 days a week. And one of those was sort of a rest core day. So rest was very, very important. And I'm kind of talking in paragraphs again. So if you want to stop me, let me know.
No, that's perfect. Tell me more about, because I think we undervalue rest.
Yes.
So let's talk about why rest is important. Like, what does rest do for you?
Rest allows your body to recover and rebuild. So basically, the way that we get stronger is by overloading our body, doing something that we're not quite used to, and then our body will adapt to that. Well, when we overload our body, we actually do a little bit of damage, and that's okay. That's fine. That's part of being human. But you do need rest time to make sure that your body has time to recover and repair and rebuild stronger in order to then try and overload it again. And so that's what we call progressive overload, is that the first week of the training in the first, 4 months, she did, I think, let's say something like 20 miles. And by the end of the 4 months, she was doing 40 plus miles. And in the beginning, she was only doing like 7 or 8 mile hikes. And at the end, she was doing like 15, 17-mile hikes. But all throughout that, we were slowly increasing that challenge to her body, but also providing her body time to rest and recover. And the only setback she had during her training, when she started her training, it was kind of a part of the year where we have a lot of computer work going on. And so she was basically just doing her workouts. And then a month or two into her training, let's say 2 months, let's say halfway into her training, kind of wrapped up that part of our work annual calendar and started traveling a lot more again. Well, when you travel, you're walking a lot, and we didn't adjust her workout plan appropriately. That was my mistake. And she started getting some nagging injuries and some pain and some strains and things like that. And what we thankfully realized quickly was that, hey, we're not accounting for the tens of thousands of steps we're doing each day for travel as we walk around these different cities and explore these new places. And then you're trying to go hike and do your training plan on top of that. So what we had to do was monitor her step count, because she always tracks her steps. She loves doing that. I think that's an important part of it for some people, is to kind of have a tracking system for steps or calories or whatever you like to track. Um, she was tracking her steps anyway, so we kind of deducted or subtracted out from her training program how much walking we were doing just in day-to-day life via travel. And after a bit of rest and recovery and taking that into consideration, she had no other issues through the rest of her training and through her hike. So that was something to definitely keep in mind and give a heads up to others, is that we do have our most people have relatively sedentary lives with computer jobs, and so our exercise can be accounted for very specifically. But hey, if you play ultimate frisbee, but it's only during the summer, and you wonder why you're having some issues. Well, because now twice a week you're going out and you're running for an hour. That's a big jump, especially if you're trying to continue doing your normal exercise program. That's a lot of volume increase. So again, increases in exercise need to be slow, and also we need to keep in mind what else we're doing in our daily life that might be impacting that.
So if you, I mean, everything's an experiment, right? Life is an experiment. If you were going to recommend, if someone wanted to do the Cotswolds way, how long do you think you would recommend to train? I know Helene did it in 4 months. Do you think that's appropriate? Would you have, in an ideal world, given her an extra 2 months? Like, is there a, not having watched it, is there anything that you would have tailored differently based on this first experience?
I think it depends where you're starting from. And I've actually kind of flipped through the pages here, and I think I said she started with something like 20 miles a week. No, she started with 9 miles a week. So let me correct myself on that. Um,
No
so
worries.
I think it depends where you start from. So like her first week, she was going out and she was doing like up to a 5 mile walk. Based on our life and travels and kind of our lifestyle, that was appropriate for her, but it may not be appropriate for everybody. And you may need another 2 to 3 weeks to a month to get up to that point in your training program. So you just need to decide kind of the progression should be very, very slow. And the reason I emphasize that is because it's better to be doing your exercise program 2 months from now, reliably forming those habits, not having injuries, than going overly hard for the first week or month. You end up with injuries. It's really hard to keep up with mentally as well. And then you just give up and you never really do what you plan to do. So I think 4 months for somebody who is already walking multiple miles a week regularly is reasonable. If you're not walking at all, you probably need to add a month or two to that. So it just would depend where your fitness level is at.
And once you've trained for this big event, right? You've done this long exercise prescription. I think it's the now what, right? I accomplished my goal. Okay, now what? Do I do a deconditioning program? Not deconditioning, but like I'm in this shape where I'm walking so much, which probably isn't reasonable to keep doing. So now what? How do you kind of change and shift focuses, gears? What's your suggestion on that?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to take time off after you've done an intensive training program followed by an intensive event. And I think that's what we see. I think everyone can relate who has kids or knows school age kids, the increase in the injury rate of children, middle school, high school kids that are having these exercise induced injuries or chronic injury fatigue or exercise fatigue is because these kids these days are going through these high intensity sports seasons, and they're doing one right after another after another after another with no recovery period. If you're a professional athlete, any athlete, football, soccer, baseball, you have a season, and the majority of your year is geared up to training and preparing and being at the highest level of performance you can for that season, and then maintaining that level of performance throughout the season. And then you take a substantial rest and recovery period after the season to allow your body to recover for that, so that you then can start training again and preparing for your next season. That's how professional athletes train. That's how, if you're going to do an intensive hike or bike ride or triathlon or whatever it may be that you're training for, if you need to take some time off afterwards to give your body an appropriate amount of time to rest and recover. And that doesn't have to mean you do nothing and you sit on the couch. And I think it's actually rather important that you do something, but the volume and the intensity needs to be very reduced in order to give your body time to relax and recover and heal from that damage or that overloaded progressive that we talked about that's going on throughout your entire time of training and during your event. So your body needs an extended amount of time to recover from that. So, for instance, Helene did the program, and I think she didn't do any extended walks for at least 3 weeks, even though she was really excited about it and really enjoyed her hiking. She did a few short, small walks, or maybe some core workouts or some other light stuff or some light bike rides, that sort of thing. But she didn't get back into, let's say 8+ mile hikes for 3 weeks or a month after her training program. I think generally speaking, if I'm thinking back on just kind of my education, I think they recommended after a long training season, like a 6-week recovery period. And again, that's not doing nothing, but it's very dramatically reducing your volume and intensity.
That makes a lot of sense. And now I want to talk about what it looks like to do this in America, because I know Europe has such amazing ways to do long walking. Do you have any recommendations for how to do something like this in America?
So Helena's been looking into that a lot lately, so I may let her comment more on that. America is very famous for its long distance, more kind of backcountry trails. Um,
Hmm.
and I think the big three are like the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail,
Yep,
and
that's
the Continental Divide. And then you may know more about those, Shauna, than me, to be honest. A bit of a different style from what Helene did. So Helene did what you would call end-to-end hiking. So every night she was in a different town, in a different hotel, and she paid for a luggage service to transfer her bags. I think that's more easy to accomplish in Europe, where they have the population density for that. It's just in America we have our big wide open spaces, and we don't have a lot of hiking trails in our more urban areas. Whereas everywhere is urban in Europe, so the hiking trails just kind of fit where they can. But I do know we have lots of epic, long distance, more kind of backcountry trails, and Lee might be able to comment more on similar trails to what she did, but in the US.
And you don't have to know the answer to this because this is a pretty difficult question to answer. But what do you think the difference is in exercise mentality, Europe versus US? Just having lived and been in Europe for a while.
Yeah, I think that their day to day life is more active, meaning they're much less car based, and they enjoy walking or cycling to and from work or out to social events in the evening or wherever. So I think that's a big part of it. I think another big part of it is that we haven't talked a lot about, but is a huge portion of this is their diet or their nutrition. Um, you can out eat any exercise program on the planet. I don't have a lot of formal education in it, but been around a lot of registered dietitians and that sort of thing, is that you can out eat any sort of exercise program you can come up with, that it's very easy to consume more calories than it is to burn. And just a personal example of that from Helene's life is that while she was writing her book, she was walking 20,000 steps every day, which is quite a bit. And she's doing that outside through formal exercise, but also on the treadmill while riding. And she was frustrated that she didn't lose any weight. But she wasn't making any sort of dietary changes at all, or if in fact, I suppose she was actually consuming a bit more calories. Whereas for the Cotswold way, she was quite motivated to perform well at that. And so she made significant exercise, but also dietary changes. And lo and behold, she ended up losing a substantial amount of weight and is healthier for it. So it's as far as the difference between nutrition in the US and versus Europe, I think people get a little too hung up on that sometimes. I think the biggest difference is that their portion sizes are just smaller. Like I said, we do think they're more particularly lifestyle active and that they walk and bike and instead of using cars. But I also, they like to eat and drink a lot of wine and cheese and sausages and high calorie foods. They just seem to manage their portions a bit differently, I think. And then maybe there's something to the different additives and that sort of stuff. But just based on my education, I really think it's a calories in, calories out thing. And they're a bit more active, so they have a little more calories out. And they just must have smaller portions and less calories in because they seem to enjoy very rich, fine foods over here, particularly in France. So that's what I've said about that.
to wrap it up, let's talk about what you're doing now, because I think you're using a lot of your planning skills that you maybe gleaned from grad school. And maybe this is always you, but how have you used your planning skills in your current life?
Yeah, so I've always had kind of an organized project based, I guess, way of thinking. So currently, Helene and I are making moves, moving our home. So we are currently in the French Alps. We spent about a year in Oxford, England, and while we very much enjoyed that, we had kind of a rough winter last winter with the rain and the clouds. Go figure, it rains in the UK, which we knew, but we had the wettest winter on record of all history, so that was a tough one. And we also lost a dog last summer, and we have another older dog, and we wanted to be able to take her on more of our travels. And flying out of the UK wasn't really conducive for that, so we decided to move to mainland Europe. So we spent the winter in the French Alps, and then we'll be moving to Montenegro in a couple weeks, and we'll be living near the beach because we've never done that. And we're kind of trying to decide where we want to live long term, and whether that's in the mountains, at the beach, or where that may be. But yeah, there's a lot of planning and thought process that goes into making multiple international moves in a number of months. So that's kind of what we're doing now. And yeah, I think that does play well with some of these things we've been talking about as far as having goals, whether they're fitness or life or whatever. I think it's best to plan to accomplish them. And so that's kind of been a strength of mine. And that's where we are now.
Well, please plug anything that you guys have coming up. I know you just sold out all three of your Christmas cruises, which huge congratulations. What other things can people follow you? How can people follow along with your adventures? And yeah, plug anything that you'd like.
Sure. Everything is at Helene in Between. We're biggest on Instagram, but that's also the website and TikTok. We don't really do YouTube or podcasts, although I do consume a lot of podcasts. So I appreciate you creating this. I know your listeners are going to love it. But yeah, everything can be found at Helene in Between. And that's really all I have to say. I do know that the Cotswold plan that Helene used to successfully complete the Cotswold Way is available on our websites at heleneinbetween.com. Not at Helene in Between, but www.heleneinbetween.com.
I'll link it.
And so yeah, and so that would be kind of the most relevant topic to this podcast. Otherwise, yeah, just really enjoyed meeting with your mom. I think it's really cool that you're doing this podcast and sharing your expertise on physical therapy with the world. Having watched my father and my father-in-law and myself, I had a shoulder injury a number of years ago through mountain biking. It's amazing what we can do through medical science, both from a surgical perspective, but also it seems that a lot of the improvements come through our rehab afterwards. Or if you don't find improvements, it's maybe because you weren't doing the rehab that your physical therapist told you to do. So, I would say physical therapy is really just a more medically focused approach towards exercise and maybe injury recovery or surgery
Absolutely.
recovery. And you're literally going there to do exercises, and so you're an expert on this for sure. So yeah, that's how I guess I'd wrap it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the plug. It's like two sides of the same coin. Like, I so appreciate people who talk about exercise prescription, because I think a lot of people I see wouldn't wind up seeing me if they had had a prescription. So I think, like you were saying, the prevention is so huge, and that's something that I'm super passionate about. So I'm so glad to hear it from an exercise physiology perspective. And I hope everyone else is too, because I think it's, again, so important and not something that we hear a lot about is the prevention aspect of it and the corporate prevention aspect of it. So that was so fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We will catch you next week. You're listening to Authentically Shawna with Dr. Shawna Burke. The information contained in this podcast is provided for information purposes only and is not intended for the purposes of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products or techniques referred in this podcast, consult your healthcare provider. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests.